You are listening to Workplace Stories, a podcast by Red Thread Research about the near future of work.
I'm Stacia Garr, co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread.
And I'm Danny Johnson, co-founder and principal analyst at Red Thread.
And I'm Chris Pirrie of the Learning Futures Group. And you're listening to Season 6 of Workplace Stories, a season we call the Great Reconnection.
We would like to thank our friends at Torch for sponsoring this podcast season. Torch is the people development platform that fuels leadership development through the power of trusted relationships. By combining coaching, mentoring, and collaborative learning, Torch helps you develop successful leaders aligned with your organization's strategies and values. Visit trch.info for more information.
Danny, we are about to begin our 6th season.
Can you believe that?
It's hard to believe. I think our listeners would want to know what's the focus for this new season and why is this our topic?
Yeah. So you and I have talked a lot lately about this idea of connection. Connection is the responsibility of organizations for sure, more broadly. But I think leadership has a special role to play. And so we want to talk to organizations that have a strong ability to connect their employees to the organization and the role that leaders play in that.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. The other thing I think is we've seen in our own research, particularly our most recent performance management work, that connection is so important. And yet there's a dearth of it. And it's not something we can just leave to managers to connect or even just leaders to connect, but we need to create organizational systems that enable connection. And so that's some of the stuff that we're going to talk about this season.
Yeah, I'm really excited about it. We just finished a season on hybrid work. If you haven't listened to that, you definitely could. But we talked specifically about physical space in that one and how physical space plays a role in how people work and those types of things. We're also realizing as we start doing these podcasts, we're realizing the importance of thinking through physical space and how it plays or does not play a role in connection. I think we've assumed for years that idea of connection only happens when you're face to face, and the leaders that we're talking to are debunking that a little bit. So we're excited to dig into that a little bit as well. Tell me, Stacia, how, we've done 6 of these seasons already. How does this topic fit into the flow of what we've done already? Skills, more skills, hybrid work, purpose, DEIB, all of those.
I think it fits very nicely because as we think about connection and how do we enable it, some of the specific things like understanding both the organization's purpose and then connecting that to the individual's purpose, that is right down the alley of the Great Reconnection, as we're calling it. Also, DEIB. Connection is fundamentally about belonging and feeling like you are included. So there's a very strong relationship there. And then I think one of the things is interesting is with skills, one might be tempted to think, hey, skills isn't so much a part of connection. I keep hesitating. I almost keep saying connected to connection, which is kind of a mess. But I think the thing is when we have people who are deployed into roles where they can use their skills or they feel like they're developing the skills they want for their career, they do feel connected to the organization and connected to their work. So I think skills even fits in here. And then hybrid, that's the big thing driving all of it, right? With hybrid, we are asking how can we connect in different ways than we have in the past? How do we reconnect people and take advantage of, having some people back in the office, but in a different sort of format than before? And how do we make sure that connection, particularly back in the office, is not just social roulette or the social lottery, so that we're purposely connecting with each other?
So I'm going to ask you a question that's not necessarily in the script. You said that we're seeing a dearth of connection. Yeah. What do you think has caused that or is causing that?
Some of the things that maybe the pandemic was accelerated. There's so many things the pandemic accelerated, but one of them I think is some differing perspectives on things like politics and other things that make some people say, oh, well, I'm not sure about this relationship, or I'm not sure about this perspective, or the rest of that. So I think that, kind of the social isolation, along with just the political and social upheaval that we've had over the last few years, has contributed to this sense of people feeling disconnected from one another. And so as we think about this season, yes, it is, reconnecting after the pandemic, as it were, but I think it's more important than that. Right? It's more important for our society and for our countries for people to feel connected to one another and to have safe space where they work.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that we're seeing is communities seem to be disintegrating a little bit. Religion doesn't play the same role that it used to. And so organizations are kind of taking on the responsibility of that connection.
Yeah. And what's interesting is in our previous season, we had Michael Arena on the line, and he talked about how he was extremely worried about culture, and culture being the next thing that's going to start to kind of fall apart within organizations because of the reduction in connections that people have, but then also just the changes in the way that people are connecting. So he really had a rallying call to action for us all to think about culture and think about connection and how we're enabling that within our companies. And so I think in this coming season, we're going to really build on that point. So on that note, Danny, maybe we should share with folks some of the folks that we have lined up for the season.
Yeah. So just to give you a sneak peek of 3 that we've already recorded and can share with you, we were able to talk to Liz Wiseman, who's the CEO of the Wiseman Group and the author of Multipliers, which is probably her most well-known book. She talks specifically about leaders and what leaders can do to build those connections to both the personal relationship between employee and leader, but also more broadly to the organization. One of my favorite ideas from her was this idea of context, that leaders have to provide context in order to build that connection. We also talked to Matt Gosney, who's the Vice President of Organizational Development at UC Health. They're doing some really interesting things as well. Purpose is a big deal for UC Health. A lot of people decide to work there because they believe in the purpose. I think he said that their mission was 3 words long: we improve lives, which I thought was great and really encompasses all kinds of things that require connection in order to make happen.
And I love that he actually then connected that, because you would think with healthcare that that's just about improving the lives of employees, but he said, no, that actually is part of our mission with, lives of patients, but that's also a part of our mission with employees. And the thing I also loved about that episode is that he lays out some of the specific talent management practices that can get changed to enable that connection and to enable that focus on improving lives.
Yeah, he calls specifically out performance management. So if you're rejiggering your performance management process, he's a really good episode to listen to.
If you can't wait for more episodes on the Great Reconnection, we have also dropped an early access episode this season. Just head on over to redthreadresearch.com/podcast/early access to hear from Dave Ulrich, who's been called the father of modern HR for his work on organization capability, collaboration, talent management, and culture change.
He's written over 30 books, over 200 articles. He has lots of really good things to say about people practices in general, but especially leadership. He talks about effective leadership, leadership brand, leadership sustainability, and his current work is really interesting. It talks about creating a leadership capital index, which is going to help organizations look at leadership through the eyes of investors. It was great to catch up with him, but just also talking to him, the conversation was incredibly rich. Join us for a sneak peek of his episode. You don't have to wait till the end of the season. You can actually tune in now at redthreadresearch.com/podcast/early access. Let's talk about some of our own personal experiences with Connection, Stacia. How did we ensure, particularly in our organization, that some of those connections weren't lost over the pandemic?
Yeah, I think in some ways we had an easier time of it because we were a remote organization before the pandemic, and many of us already had, that experience. And so we as an organization have tried to be very intentional about talking about our culture and our norms and what's appropriate and different ways of communication and all that kind of stuff. So I think, that was a really important thing that we have we did, just in general, but have continued to do during the pandemic. The other thing I think we did really hopefully well, I'm sure our team will tell us that maybe we didn't, is we tried to make some space for the personal connections, to have, to create the space in the conversation around how are you doing? Like, actually, how are you doing? And our team certainly did not escape unscathed from the pandemic. We had someone who got stuck in India because of COVID. We had other people who got COVID. I mean, the whole 9 yards, we all had it. So I think just being open and flexible and creating the space for the conversations is the most important thing we did to enable connection.
I love that. And we saw it even this week as we discussed the Roe versus Wade. We have people on our team that sort of fall on either side of that, but we took some time just to talk about it as a group and allow space for people to think and feel and sort of reconnect with each other, even though they may not completely agree with each other, which I thought was very helpful.
as we think about outside of our organization, we talk to a lot of people, and that certainly continued during the pandemic. But at least for myself, I know I was probably more open to, random coffee chats and random, outreach from folks than maybe I was before the pandemic. And I think that is something that's been good that I've kind of uncovered. I will say, though, that the first events that I went to, I hugged people that maybe otherwise I wouldn't have hugged. But I'm like, you're real in 3D. I am so excited to see you.
Yeah.
So I think there's also been a lot of kind of reinvigorating the connections now that we've started to kind of come towards the drawdown of.
Yeah, I agree. And that's actually something we learned during the hybrid season as well, is that there is a real reason to get together during certain parts of work. And that idea of connection, breathing the same air is an important part of building those connections.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back to the podcast and talk about the podcast capstone webinar.
Yeah.
So what are we planning on for that?
Yeah, at the end of every season, we do a webinar that sort of recaps the podcast. We go over the things that we learned, the things that we didn't expect to learn. We quote a lot of the people through the podcast. And webinar is particularly interesting because we actually poll at the beginning, hey, how many did you listen to? How many of the podcasts did you listen to before you joined the webinar? And the majority of people who joined that webinar have not listened to the podcast yet. I'm sure many of them go back after we point them to certain ones that meet their needs, but it is not a, listen first and then come, but it is helpful to listen to those podcasts so that you can ask more delving questions, I suppose, and sort of tease out some of the ideas that you all are interested in and the challenges that you all are having challenges with.
Yeah.
Challenges that you're having challenges with, which I guess works.
Yeah. I think that one of the things I like most about that podcast webinar at the end of the season is that one, it's us and Chris and then our somebody from our podcast sponsor, but also because there's a number of us and because it's conversation based, we're really able to incorporate the questions and comments from the chat right into the discussion. And it feels like it's really rich and thoughtful, and it goes in the direction of what people who are on the line want to hear. So I actually think they're super fun.
I think they're fun too. And one thing that really stood out in this last one that we did is the world changed from the time we started recording to the end. And so being able to say, all right, these are the things that we thought at the beginning, or this is how things have changed since then, was kind of an important wrap up or getting together moment to make sure that we're covering everything that will help people move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing I want to call out, this also isn't in the script, but it just occurred to me, we might want to mention for folks, is usually on this kind of intro section, we have Chris with us, but this time we don't. So do we want to share a little bit about Chris and what's happening?
Chris retired, then he unretired. He's the Tom Brady of the HR world. He got a really good opportunity with Google, which he will tell you he's a noogler. He got an opportunity with Google to change the world, and he couldn't pass it up. And so a lot of his time is taken there. You'll still hear him on the podcast with us for sure. He'll still be on the final webinar, but some of the podcasts we'll be doing without him because he has other things to do now.
But we still love him. He'll still be here. So stay tuned for that lovely British voice.
Yes. We also just want to mention that the podcast listenership is actually growing really nicely. How can people engage with us to grow that community, and what are the opportunities to get involved beyond listening, Stacia?
First and foremost, folks can listen, subscribe at anywhere that they get their podcasts today. And you can also go to our website, so redthreadresearch.com/podcasts, and you can see all of the seasons that we've done and listen to them right from the website if you like. Of course, we would love to engage with you more, so you can join our newsletter. You can join as a member. We started individual monthly packages. So we've really thought about pricing for everyone because we know that, even if you don't have a big budget, that you still need great ideas. And so we're trying to do that. But I think the point is, if you don't know us, get to know us, and we want to get to know you. You can also, if you have any questions, drop us an email at hello@redthreadresearch.com.
Awesome.
Wonderful. Well, we're looking forward to a wonderful season, and this will come right before the Liz Wiseman episode, so enjoy that fantastic discussion.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to tell you that today's guest on the podcast is Liz Wiseman. We've been trying to get Liz on the podcast for a couple of seasons now, and we finally got everybody's schedules and calendars aligned to record this wide-ranging conversation in mid-June. Liz is a researcher and executive coach, and you very probably know her from her work as the author of the New York Times best-selling business book, Multipliers. She's also written books called The Multiplier Effect, Rookie Smarts, and last year she published Impact Players. Liz is the CEO of the Wiseman Group. It's a leadership research and development firm headquartered in Silicon Valley and works with Fortune 100 clients as well as senior leaders around the world. She's been listed on the Thinkers 50 ranking, and in 2019 was recognized as the top leadership thinker in the world. As part of her writing process, she conducts significant research in the field of leadership and collective intelligence, and she also writes for Harvard Business Review, Fortune, and a variety of other business journals. She's a guest lecturer at BYU and Stanford University, and a former executive at Oracle Corporation, where she worked as vice president for Oracle University and the global leader for human resource development. As you'll hear, she also worked there with me. On September of 2021, Liz testified at the hearing on civility and collaboration in Congress to discuss opportunities to help Congress foster relationships leading to a more collaborative and civil work environment. On top of all this, she's just a super nice person, and she has a gift for clarifying and simplifying and also inspiring great work and great leadership. Given all this, I think you'd agree that Liz is a perfect voice to add to our season on reconnection in a post-pandemic world. Liz, Stacia, Danny, and myself talk about the pandemic and how it's changed life and work. We talk about her philosophy on leadership and how that has to adjust in a post-pandemic world. We talk about the 5 things that impact players do to differentiate themselves in the workplace. And we distill the Multipliers thesis into just 3 words. More importantly, we talk about how the shift in the kind of leadership that we need to give and the kind of leadership we need to get has evolved in the last few years. I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation with author and leadership thinker, Liz Wiseman.
Liz Wiseman, welcome to Workplace Stories. It is so great to finally have you on a podcast that I'm associated with, because I feel like you've been on every other podcast in the world except for one with me on it. So welcome.
Oh, it's good to be here. You make me sound kind of loose with the podcast.
I wouldn't suggest that at all. We're going to start with a rapid introduction in case people haven't heard of you and your amazing work. And then we're going to go much deeper on this topic of connection and the role of managers in the new world of work. So can you give us a quick introduction to the Wiseman Group? What would you say is your mission and your purpose in the world, Liz?
Oh, well, maybe, sort of the more crass way to explain it is like we're just trying to rid the world of bad bosses and make work suck less for everyone. And like that's maybe the view of it from sort of the bottom looking up. But really what we're doing, we're trying to make like work better for everyone and, help people create organizations where you can actually do great work and be impactful and where leaders multiply the intelligence rather than drain the intelligence out of their team. So it's, like all my work is about how to make work kind of a joyful experience. I'm one of these weirdos who actually thinks work is fun. Like I love work and I just want people to enjoy it.
It's an awesome aspiration. You do writing, obviously, you're famous for your wonderful books, but you do other kinds of work as well. What does work look like for Liz Wiseman?
Well, my work cycles look like the back of a shampoo bottle, honestly. It's like,
not having any hair, that's not helpful for me. But
no, you've got a beard. I see it, Chris. No, but it's like shampoo, rinse, repeat. Like my work is research, write, teach, repeat. And I feel fortunate in that I get to do multiple research projects. I'm really lucky that, and I'm very grateful that my first book was successful. I didn't realize it was kind of like playing pinball that, you don't really get to write a bad book and then get another chance to write a good book. That, because this first book was, really, really well received, it gave me a chance to do another and another and another. And this is what I love doing, taking something from observation to inquiry, to research, to sense making, to book writing, and then distilling it even further. And that's really my work, is trying. And I think, like, if I try to boil down what is the work I do, is I try to simply describe dynamics that everybody has seen and simply put a name on it so we can talk about it. In some ways, I'm a corporate linguist.
Yeah, we'll definitely come back to that idea. Just for the record, I think your first book was Multipliers. Can you tell us the tagline for that book? Because it's gorgeous.
Oh, the subtitle is How the Best Leaders Make Everyone Smarter.
Yeah, so I'm sure many people are familiar with that book. Then you, I believe, wrote a book called Rookie Smarts, which was about how people with fresh eyes looking at problems, have this genius for solving them sometimes. Tagline for that book
is A Rookie Smarts, Why Learning Beats Knowing in the New Game of Work. And, it's in some ways about fresh eyes, but in many ways it's about no eyes. It's not that, we have sort of a fresh perspective. It's actually like the humility that's created when we don't know how to do something. When we're new to something, we tend to be humble. We tend to be open to feedback. We have to prove ourselves. We have to move quickly. We have to move with agility. It like forces us into all the good behaviors that corporations are trying to incent into their staff. And so it comes naturally when we're really at the bottom of a learning curve.
I think the next book is the current book, which published last year, I believe, and it's called Impact Players.
Impact Players, How to Take the Lead, Play Bigger, and Multiply Your Impact. Amazing. Is the subtitle for that.
I would say maybe kind of one thread through all this, you talk about work, but it's really leadership in various forms. Can you tell us, how did you come to do this kind of work, study leadership? What got you there?
I wish I could go back and say I've always been fascinated with leadership. Like I was a little girl and I was reading Teddy Roosevelt's bio, like not at all. And, I wasn't even like student body president. I think the reason why I study leadership, first of all, I have to admit, I was born just a little bit bossy. Like I've never been shy. If there is a leadership vacuum, like I will step into it. If there's a group of people who can't decide where to go for dinner, I'm going to be like, okay, this group needs a leader. I will take
McDonald's
charge.
It is.
McDonald's. So, but I think the reason why I've spent my life studying this is because I was just trying to figure it out. And it was circumstantial that, so I didn't aspire to be a writer. I didn't aspire to like be a great leader or to study great leaders. I just got thrown into a job that was too big for me. And, this was back in Oracle, and Chris, you and I spent many years together at Oracle, and it was an irresponsible workplace in that like they gave big jobs to really young, inexperienced people. And I remember like my first big leadership job, I'm thinking, why are they asking me to do it? Like I'm a kid. Like this should violate child labor laws. Like I'm like 23 years old and I'm now like the boss of all these people. And I remember thinking like, do we lack for adult supervision? In this company, like I'm not an adult, but this is an adult job. And so for me, it was like minding the gap of, I don't know how to do this, but yet I'm thrust into this job. I'm now working with all these really senior leaders. Like, what does good look like? And how do I not screw this up is how I think I began just watching and noticing, what do the good leaders do? What do the bad leaders do? Why is it that there's some really smart people who suck all the intelligence out of a room? Like, can you actually be a smart leader and not shut down smarts in others? And that led to so many questions. But for me, this was grappling with leadership myself that led to my fascination with it.
Impact.
Which is a long way of saying I'm just like working out my own issues, I suppose.
Well, let's do some context, because we really want to get your point of view on, kind of what is going on in the world of work today and what the implications are for leaders and people who are coming back to it. So Danny, do you want to sort of go through the context setting session?
Yeah. So Liz, we see a lot of the things that you're seeing. And so this season is a lot about, I think we warned you that the season is about reconnecting and particularly the role that leaders play. And so why do you think connection is so important, especially in a workplace context? And why do you think that it's particularly a strong topic right this second?
Well, I think not just connecting, but reconnecting is everything right now. We have just come through a season of disconnection, and we've been disconnecting from others. And I think I can describe it best when I can describe the walks I take in my neighborhood or out on the trails and the mountains where I live. I think two things have happened. One is we went through this pandemic and social distancing where it's if you're walking down the street and someone's walking towards you, you move to the side, you move away from them, you walk past them. And pretty soon it's you walk past them and you don't look at them because you don't want to breathe on them. And, I do a lot of hiking. And so you encounter people on the trails, and it's think of our behavior when we encounter people on the trails. It's okay, I'm going to move my body to the side of the trail. For me, it's now I'm in poison oak territory. I'm going to turn my face and not look at someone because I don't want to breathe on them. Well, we keep doing this. We're coming towards the end of the pandemic. And what I've noticed is I walk down the streets in my neighborhood and I don't make eye contact with people anymore. We pass people. And so some of it is this pandemic, germ, virus related. But, we've also been through a season of discord politically,
right, with
very different viewpoints. And I walk through my neighborhood and I have to admit, for several years, I'm I wonder who he voted for. I wonder what she voted for. And we start to wonder things. And we've been in this social disconnection and this physical disconnection, and we've been working at home in isolation. And now we're kind of being thrown back together, and we've got some of our newly acquired old habits that we have to let go of. And we're trying to reestablish how to be together. Mm-hmm. And we're doing this in an environment of remote work and hybrid work. And I think there's a couple types of disconnection we have to get beyond. The first is contextual disconnection, which, if you're working remotely, it's very easy to miss the writing on the walls, the subtext in things. You get pieces of information, but you don't get all the stuff that weaves things together. So it's very easy to start working in conceptual isolation. I'm just doing my piece, but I don't see where this is all going. And it's one of the things that managers need to do right now is to reestablish this contextual connection, connecting people to the big picture. It's
like peripheral vision. It doesn't, when you lose it, it's dramatic, the impact. But
yes, and and we've lost a couple of our senses as well. Okay, I can see things, but I can't taste it, or I see, but I don't hear. And so having to reestablish, what is this thing we're all working toward? I think it's something we have a profound loss of right now. And it's part of the manager's job is to reestablish connection to context. I think we're losing relational connection. We've been working in physical isolation and social isolation. And how do we reestablish community? And, the divisiveness that's going on at a macro level, that also exists in the workplace. I wonder how she feels about this issue. I wonder, what I don't know. And so, having to rebuild, we are a team and community, and here's, we have more in common than we have dislike. How do we rebuild that community? And here's the one that I think is the real kicker right now is working remotely. We lose our connection to it, causality, meaning I do a piece of work, I pass it to someone, and then something happens with my work. If we worked in the office and I did a piece of work and maybe I sent that, Chris, to you, I sent you off that report, you might be like, hey, Liz, you know what? That financial analysis you did, we used it in this meeting. We decided to cancel this product line. We're going to double down on this one. Hey, add a girl. But when we work remotely, I send off a piece of work. It kind of goes to the ether. people have to go through extraordinary loop backs to say, oh, by the way, Liz, you know that report you did for us 3 weeks ago? We just had the meeting yesterday and it was really helpful. Thank you. See, we tend to just move forward. And I think we're losing this sense of my work has impact. It has meaning, something good came from what I did. And this, I think, is something managers can really help their teams do, is reestablish these cause and effect relationships between our efforts and the outcome.
I love that. I love the positivity sort of associated with that, but I'm imagining that's also true with negative things. Like if something happens because I did something and I'm not aware of that thing, that has repercussions within the organization as well. So kind of based on these three things, contextual stuff, relational connections, and causality. I really love that word. You've mentioned that managers have a responsibility here. What is their responsibility? How big is their responsibility?
Well, I think these are three things to double down on. They're always been the job of leadership, but I think it is the job du jour of leader is giving people more context. Here's where we're headed. Here's why we're doing this. It's a small thing I did this year when we were putting together our plan. We do, fairly lightweight planning. We're a team of about 10 people. And it was okay, here's our initiatives. But then I added just one extra piece of information to this plan is I just put a column for every initiative, which is here's why we're doing it. And I'm oh, that's silly. Everyone knows why we're doing this. But it was really helpful. Oh no, here's this is why, if we do this, it serves this purpose, or it's because this happens. So I'm trying to establish greater context. Here's the why of what we're doing. It's letting people know, here's what's important right now. It used to be, I guess, a strategic plan was good for a year, but when things are moving fast, it's not just here's what we're doing this year, but here's what's important right now in this moment in time.
So you're describing a situation where the purpose, the job of providing purpose and context for people is really compensating for other ways in which we would typically connect if we can use all our senses, right? Mm-hmm. Which is kind of interesting. We talked quite a lot about purpose in various podcast seasons that we did. And so I'm not sure that much of our manager readiness and training teaches them on how to sort of convey purpose, but perhaps it should.
And it seems to be moving in the opposite direction, Liz. I don't know if you're saying this, but within organizations, we're having all these discussions about making work smaller. So smaller pieces of learning, people that dip in for a little piece of work and then dip back out, and maybe they don't even belong to your organization. And so in a sense, from an engineering standpoint, I'm oh yeah, that makes, that's great. We love that idea. But what we're missing, as you mentioned, is this idea of context, and we're missing the pieces that, when I do this, it has this effect on the organization, et cetera, et cetera. A couple of years ago, I actually had this brilliant idea that we could get rid of frontline managers or de-emphasize their importance if we could just provide the individuals the data. If they know how they're doing, if we can sort of get around that manager, because so many organizations complain about their frontline managers, then we can solve this problem. And we went out and collected all kinds of data, and I was rightly slapped across the face with that data when it became perfectly clear that those frontline managers are just really key to making, an organization run. And I think I'm seeing pieces of what you're saying in, why that would be, why that is important. As these organizations, there's a question in here, I promise. As we sort of move toward maybe the piecemeal aspect or making work smaller into smaller bits, how do we accommodate for that with our leadership?
Well, I think, okay, so what does, as we move to smaller little widgets, I'm doing a piece of it, it's, okay, what are the things that leaders can do? Well, helping people see what's upstream and downstream from this. I think one of the big roles of leader is perspective taking and helping your team see things through multiple perspectives. I mean, this is one of the differentiators of the impact players. Chris mentioned the book Impact Players. When I looked at the difference between people who were doing, so in a room full of equally smart, talented, hardworking people, why are some people going through the motions of doing their job and other people are making a big impact, doing work that's inordinately of greater value, they build influence and power, and they have impact in the workplace. One of the key differentiators is that they see things through multiple perspectives. They're not just doing their job. They have the ability to say, okay, here's my job, but this is really the job that needs to be done. To understand the difference between your job and what needs to be done, you have to understand what's needed, what's important, what's happening around you. And I think it's one of the differentiators of the impact players, but it's one of the things that managers can do to help people have greater impact, is to help them see what's happening around you, what's changing upstream, what's changing downstream, like also to provide like that meaning and purpose. And as we look at the Great Resignation and the Great, what is it? Like, we've got a lot of versions of this: resignation, realization, realignment, and reconnection. Like, so many people are leaning because they're like, well, when I was stripped of my workplace and my work friends, and it was just me and my work, it wasn't that fulfilling. It didn't feel meaningful to me. So like, part of our meaning comes from who we work with and where we work. Like, when I was at Oracle, like, I took pride in the fact, like, man, I work with some really amazing people. And I love like who we are together. So it's building that community and that context, but also reminding people, like, here's what people do with our work. Like, we write these reports and do these financial analysis, but then people use them to make like multi-million-dollar decisions and investments. Like, our work matters in that process. We're not just building a car, we're creating a way for people to get from point A to point B safely. Like, that's what we're doing. And it's not hyping it up and selling it. It's just like stepping back and saying, here's really fundamentally what we're trying to do.
Hey, so I love this idea. And I actually want to move us toward your first book. You wrote a book called Multipliers. You outlined two types of leadership styles there: multipliers and diminishers. And I'm assuming that some of these things that you've talked about, creating vision and purpose and helping people see context, is the multiplier leadership style. Can you give us sort of a rundown on those two different styles?
Well, okay, yes and no. So I want to be really like honest with the research. Like, that was not one of the differentiators between multipliers and diminishers. It's what just good leaders do. So here's what I studied. I studied why we're at our best around certain leaders. And it's like, what are the things that those leaders are doing that either allow us to take control of our work and perform at our very best, versus the leaders around whom we shut down and play it safe. I think both the diminisher and the multiplier can provide context. It's what happens after that that really determines whether people step up or shrink around these leaders. And it has everything to do with how much autonomy they give people. Like, kind of in short, what the multiplier leader does is they give people context and they give people challenge, and then they just get out of their way and let them go at it. And maybe to try to do this in some shorthand, like, I can boil that book down to 2.5 words. Like, I wish I could have done that before I wrote the book. It would have been like a tweet rather than a book. But, what the best leaders tend to do, I've observed, is they create two coexisting simultaneous conditions. One is safety and the other is stretch. So the best leaders create safety and stretch, which is sort of those 2.5 words, like safety, psychological safety, intellectual safety, the ability to disagree, to speak truth to power, to take risks, to learn, to speak out, creating a sense of belonging, like feeling like included, valued, all of that. They create a great work environment. And there's lots of leaders who create a great work environment, but they don't then push people inside that environment. Like, they create safety, but they don't create stretch. Mm-hmm. And then there's a lot of leaders who create stretch, but no safety. And we know what it's like to work for someone who's all stretch, no safety. It's terrifying, like, it's debilitating, it's stressful. But we also think about maybe having worked for someone who's all safety, all feel good. Like, you feel like, they're going to put their arm around you. You know what, Stacia, you're important. We value you. We're just so glad you're on team. But they never ask you to do anything hard, or they never let you do anything hard, or they never let you take responsibility. They step in and they like save you when things get tough. But when we can create those two conditions in roughly equal measure, simultaneously, people do their best thinking and their best work.
So, Liz, as you think about now, because Multipliers was a few years ago, and if you think about now, is there something that you would add to that Or is there some nuance that would go underneath that safety and stretch, particularly as we're thinking about that reconnection?
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what I was saying is like the research I did on multipliers explains some of what leaders need to do right now, but I think there's a few additional things. So like if you want to build a team that can be really engaged and impactful in this moment in time, for starters, be a multiplier, be someone around whom people step up, take responsibility, contribute at their fullest. Well, that involves giving people a lot of autonomy and space and safety and stretch. But number two, make sure people understand the target. World is changing really fast. Like we have to constantly recalibrate and redirect. So like help people know here's what's important right now. Like targets are moving. This is the target that we're shooting at right now. Create a culture of team wins where people on a team don't feel like they're competing against each other. They feel like each person brings a unique skill set and talent. And, I think a great example of this is the Golden State Warriors. And, they're super talented. They're super fun to watch. But the thing that I think makes that team remarkable is just how they treat each other. The fact that they can celebrate Curry and his incredible talent, but that doesn't come at the cost of any of the other players. Like they each bring something kind of remarkable and it's celebrated, and they're not like at war for, well, who's the real superstar of the team? Like who's the MVP? The team just doesn't work this way. And you create a culture of wins. It's like, okay, celebrate each person's unique genius, compete externally, not internally, pass the pen, meaning share leadership. I study and write about, teach leadership for a living. Like in some ways, what I want to just tell everyone right now is, we just need to go back to doing it the way we did in third grade, because that's the model we need right now in third grade. Like, do you remember, that's probably kindergarten through probably fourth or fifth grade. Up on the front of the board, there was all the jobs that needed to be done, like clean the chalkboard or like who led the team, the class out to recess, who brought them back in. And that those responsibilities rotated. There wasn't like a class president. There was a lot of different jobs that had to be done. And the children each got to take a turn leading. And then when your turn was done, you passed it to somebody else. And one of the things that we found that really differentiated the impact players from others is they step up and lead when there's ambiguity around who's really in charge. But they don't stay in the lead. They're not like, okay, I have to be the boss. Like I'm the one who will decide where we go for dinner. I'm the one who will figure this out. They rotate that. Like someone like steps up and leads, but then they're like as comfortable stepping back. They're leaders who are as comfortable following others as they are taking the lead themselves. And it's this very fluid model of leadership we need right now.
I think that sort of speaks to some of the changes we've seen moving towards a more networked versus hierarchy model within organizations. I think that illustrates it beautifully. Today, actually, we are launching a new report on performance management. And one of the things that we found really aligns well with what you're sharing, which is in our previous study, we saw that clarity, so clarity around your goals or your targets or that type of work, was something that really resided with managers. Now, what we're seeing is that, yes, managers are part of that, but there's also an organizational obligation to make sure that clarity and reinforcing clarity is built into the culture and the systems that the organization has. And so what you were just talking about, which actually just reminds me of the chore board I have for my two children who are in that target age range. But what that makes me think of is, what are the systems that organizations should be building that will enable leaders to do these things, like what you were just discussing, or enable the impact players to do these things? So, the literal vision of it is a chore board for kindergartners, but what is the office version of that?
Oh, well, so let me give you some of my favorites right now. Yeah. And let me rattle off, a half a dozen, and maybe one of them will be useful to people who are listening. One is, we have one as a team. We call it a win board. What's important now? And it's a Google Doc, and it's a dynamic doc, and it just is like, hey, here's what's important in this moment in time. And then, people can assign their names to it. Another thing that I think is helpful is kind of like work snapshots. You know how we take pictures of like, oh, here's my meal, here's my dinner, here's what I'm eating in this moment of time. Like just doing a snapshot of like, here's what's on my plate right now. Like letting people know, here's what I'm working on, here's what's important. Something I just did recently for my team, I was like deeply immersed in an authoring thing. And everyone's like, Liz, how can we help? I'm like, I don't know. You know, when you're too busy to ask for help. Yes. And you're like, I can't slow down to explain where I am. Like nobody can help me. And every time I get in a state where like, I decide no one can help me, I'm like, this is when you need to ask for help. And so what I did is I created a help wanted list. And I'm like, here are the things that I'm working on that I could use some help on. And I'm like, I don't even know who to ask or who's free to do what. I just know I need help. So I made this help wanted list, again, an open doc, and I just put it out there to the team. And there was 4 of us. And within 12 hours, every single thing on that help wanted list, somebody had said, I can do that. I can do that. And they signed up by choice. And, you know, cool. We get moving so fast. I'm like, I don't even know who to ask and who has time to help, but just make a help wanted list. Let people know I'm in like a tough spot right now, and let people sign up. And I think that's a way for us to collaborate when we feel like we're moving too fast to even know who to ask. And particularly, like, how do I know if someone's busy? I can't see their face. You know, I can't walk by the cube and see like, wow, Jason is like got his head down on the table. He's like struggling right now.
But it's a nice psychological safety play, isn't it? Look, as a leader, I'm prepared to ask for help. I'm modeling that behavior.
Yeah, it was magical what happened. I would encourage people to try like help wanted lists. Like we don't use them like, oh, I'm too lazy to do my job. Like but like where it's clear that, you know, people want to help and they want to contribute, but you don't know who to ask. Just make a help wanted list. Those are all things that I think can help with like contextual reconnection, things that can help with relational reconnection. The first is just the practice of, I call it check-in before diving in. Our team started it early on in the pandemic, and it's kind of a practice that we've been using for years. We've been a work from home team for years. And whenever we get together, whether it's an online meeting or in person, we just devote the first, 20% of the time to just like, how are you? And, you know, early in the pandemic, we would just meet weekly and it was just, how are you? And the 100% of the meeting was just like, how are you doing? But, you know, if we're going to meet for an hour, like sometimes like the first 10 minutes or more is just like, quick, how's everyone doing? And everyone's got fun ways to do this with like, you can use fingers, you can use emojis, but building this practice of not assuming everyone is okay and ready to just dive into work. Like sometimes we just need to be human for a few minutes first. And the more you do it, and if you normalize it, what I found is that people will be honest. And you'll build this capability as a team to say, like, I'm not doing great right now. Even things like I started to do, instead of, oh, hey, let's have everyone go around the room and say, here, what are you proud of? What's going well? I'm like, okay, you know what? We're going to start this meeting with, like, what are you disappointed in? Like, where have you like let yourself down? Like, what did you not get done this last quarter that you're all like feel a little bit bad about? And people are like, really? Was Liz lost her mind? Like, not very motivational.
I'm like, how much time do you have?
As Chris's wife, always loved working with Chris. But people would be like, well, I was really hoping to get this done last quarter, but I didn't. And I kind of feel bad. And people are like, yeah, me too. I didn't get that done either. And suddenly it normalizes people talking honestly. And, you know, I think, well, that's going to be demotivational. It's going to like normalize, like, hey, you don't have to be accountable for your work. I find it's exactly the opposite. So check in before diving in. Another practice I would recommend is, I call it yield signs, which is particularly if you are working in a hybrid setting where certain people are inherently or like situationally disadvantaged. If you just practice this one rule, which is you yield the right of way to the disadvantaged participant. So like in the driving world, we have these yield signs, but you yield to the more advantaged, like, you know, the car that's on the main thoroughfare that's going straight. And like the person who's off that road has to wait to get in. I find that if you just decide to yield to whoever is participating at a disadvantage, you're going to build a more inclusive meeting. Well, they're remote and everyone else is in an office. Great. Whenever they speak, everyone stops and they listen. But maybe that person is working outside their time zone or has English or that dominant language as a second language, or maybe is underrepresented in that population or new. And it's just the simple practice of we yield to that person and we all agree to it, I think really levels that playing field in a hybrid setting. I heard this idea recently. I haven't tried it myself. I love the idea. I'm calling it the after party. One of the things that we miss that we used to have in person is we would all go to a meeting, whether it's an all hands meeting, a product launch, or just a meeting. And then there would be an after party. Oh, did you hear that? That's kind of a crazy idea. Or what's that? Or that's new. Or I think that's dumb. Or I agree. I disagree. And we would collectively process things, which, I know I'm speaking with a group of learning experts. This collective processing is as important as individual processing. And when we work remotely, we finish our meeting and we go our way and we're not, what did you see? What did you hear? That sense making is missing. And I've heard of groups that hold kind of a meeting after the meeting, after parties, just with no agenda other than to process. What did you hear? What did you think?
And we do that with our roundtables. We will do a retrospective right after where we go through and we talk about what worked well, what didn't work well, what we're going to do differently next time. And that gives us an opportunity to synthesize and to learn collectively. So I love that idea for other types of meetings as well.
Yeah. It's almost like that check-in before diving in is the pre-meeting, and then there's this after party. And I think we need to establish the ramp up and the ramp down from work and meetings and conversations. It happens so naturally in an office, and we have to create it in a remote world.
That makes sense. We talked a lot about what leaders can do. Can we switch a little bit to talking about from impact players, what individuals can be doing? Because in some instances, they may not be working for folks who have listened to this podcast and use these great ideas.
Yeah, I think here are the things I found that the impact players do differently than others. So maybe we'll start there. The first thing I found, and maybe here's the most important thing I found in the research, is that when managers were comparing the people that they've led or, managed to have had extraordinary impact versus other solid contributors, what I found is that the solid contributors, they took responsibility, they did their jobs well, they followed direction, they carried their weight on teams, they were focused. I'm like, wow, this seems like a classic top performer. And what I found is what I called these ordinary contributors, they were absolutely stellar in ordinary times. But as soon as the work and the situation got messy and complicated and convoluted, and when things started to get ambiguous and uncertain, this VUCA world, that's where this way of working fell short and where the impact players worked in very different ways. And there were 5 situations in particular that impact players handled really differently than other rock solid contributors. So the first is when problems were really messy, ordinary contributors did their job, whereas impact players did the job that was needed. So they're a little bit rangy, flexible, yeah, that's my job, but that's not really my job. My job is to go solve problems. I'm going to go venture into no man's land.
Going from solving the problem that the teacher gives you to solving the problem that just exists. So
exactly. Rather than oh no, this is my worksheet, I have to work through this.
Right.
Which means you have to pay attention to what's happening around you, and you have to normalize problems. Having problems is normal. That's my job, not to avoid them, but to solve them. Okay. So the second was what we do when roles are unclear. Okay. We're all collaborating, but who's really in charge? And the ordinary contributors, they were willing leaders, and in some ways ready leaders, but they were leaders in waiting. meaning, hey, if someone appoints me to lead the task force or the initiative or the meeting, like I'm there. But in absence of like, they're waiting for direction. Meanwhile, the impact players are like, oh, I don't need to be the boss to be the boss. Like or maybe it's just all rationalizing my, take charge bossy behavior. But it's like
assertive behavior, Liz, assertive.
I think there's nothing wrong with being bossy. You just don't want to be a bad bossy. You just, but it's saying this situation needs a leader, and I'm willing to step up and lead, but I'm also willing to step back and follow, both of which require a fair bit of confidence. So it's this agile form of leadership. It's a sense of like, hey, you know what? At 2:00, I am the boss. Like I'm in charge of this meeting, this initiative. I might be leading a group of my peers. My boss might be in the room, but I'm the boss at 2:00. Mm-hmm. But at 3:00, I log into a different meeting. And in that meeting, I'm not the boss. Like someone who works for me is the boss of that meeting. And my job is to support them in their leadership. And so it's like being willing to go in and out of the boss role throughout the day and throughout the week, as opposed to like, oh no, I am anointed the boss, which is a very different mental model of leader.
Can I ask you a question about this? Here you are, you're something of a world expert on leadership, and you get there, as you said before, because of your own exploration, insecurities, which I don't believe at all, but it's a good story. And then you just hang out with really amazing leaders and it sparks a question in you, and you study, you research, you do a lot of work, you write this book, and then you engage in this dialogue about what good leadership is and what bad leadership is. And now you write a book for individuals, which is really about kind of leading yourself. You're sort of providing models for looking for when the universe wants you to do something and looking for opportunities to step in and so on and so forth. Is it because the traditional leadership models that you studied before are starting to fail us that you're now turning your attention to helping people lead themselves? Or am I just reading too much into this?
Well, I don't know if you're reading too much into it. Can I make like some statements of belief about what I have learned from this research? What I have learned is that, number one, people don't want bosses. Like they want to be led. They don't want to be managed. And there's a lot of people who are like over managing their teams and under leading their teams. Like people want leadership not to be managed. And that's really what Multipliers is. It's about creating an environment where instead of like being that kind of bossy, know-it-all, controlling kind of boss, it's like saying, I'm going to give you some context. I'm going to like understand what to put you on, but I'm going to give you charge of your own work. And it is the condition under which people do it. That's safety, but that stretch. That people don't want to be managed. They don't want bosses. So I study these leaders who deeply utilize people's talent. I call them multipliers, versus leaders who end up using a fraction of people's talent. I call them diminishers. Here's what I've learned is that when people describe working hard but being underutilized, nobody in the entire world describes that as a good gig. Yeah. Nobody wants the job where like, hey, I'm paid well. But you know what? They don't expect much of me. I don't have to make hard decisions. Like, I got this like kind of lightweight, cushy job. My boss does all the hard stuff and I just kind of do whatever she tells me to do. Nobody likes that job. People describe that experience as being exhausting and frustrating. So people describe being underutilized as frustrating and exhausting. Versus people who describe working for these multiplier leaders are like, okay, it was a little bit exhausting. I was working really hard, but it was totally exhilarating. Here's this other truth that I've learned is that people come to work, whether you work in tech or biotech or manufacturing or education or medicine, like people come to work desperately wanting to contribute 100% of their capability. It's a good gig for no one to be underutilized. Everyone wants to like fully contribute. So then I do this research on impact players and like what managers really value from the contributor. And here's what I learned. Managers don't want to be bossy. As part of the research, I looked at like, what is it that managers most love that people do and what is it that they most hate? Okay, I got to give you some of this list here. What managers hate: when people give them problems without solutions, when they wait for the boss to tell them what to do, when the boss has to chase them down and remind them, when you just do your piece, they don't worry about the picture. Like, managers don't want to have to tell people what to do. They don't want to have to follow up like what they want. Okay, and then here's a list of what they most appreciate. Number one, doing things without being asked. Anticipating problems, having a plan to solve them, help your teammates, like be curious, ask good questions, ask for feedback. Like, managers don't want to manage people. And
turns out,
like, nobody wants the job of like, did you do it, by the way? Hey, Chris, did you do it? Have you turned in your receipts yet? You know, like, like even bossy bosses, you know, like, and micromanagers don't like doing it. We resent it. And so, like, okay, then do we say, well, people don't want to work for micromanagers. Managers don't like managing. Let's go with no managers. Like, Danny, you said you tried looking at that scenario. It doesn't work very well. Like, we want leaders, but we want situational leaders. Someone who's like, okay, I will lead this effort. Great. Let me sign up for that. Let me like put my name on the help wanted list and let me contribute. But we want those people to not like stay in those roles as like little tyrannical dictators and willing to say, okay, now you lead this one and I'll write my name on your sign up sheet. Like, that's kind of the natural order of things. And it's just corporations, we've screwed it up by having org charts and job descriptions and boundaries. Like, they're all artificial.
So can we talk about that for just a second? Because I agree with you. I've actually avoided leadership positions my entire life because I did not want to manage other people. I find myself in a situation now where I'm learning that there are joys in that, but I haven't really loved it. But I do know that in organizations, culture plays a large role into whether or not somebody can step into a messy problem, for example, or whether or not somebody feels empowered to lead in certain situations. So when you're talking about sort of leading yourself, what is the organization's responsibility to make sure that those things can happen?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that. One, it gives me a chance to round out those other three, which we promised we would do. And then I got excited, like, okay, here are the other three. When like there's unforeseen obstacles, the ordinary contributor escalates the issue, which is what organizations have built around, like approval matrices, escalation chains. The impact players, they just hold on to ownership and they get it across the finish line, not alone, but they kind of like triage and coordinate a response. In some ways, instead of handing off to higher ups, they hold on to it and they get the higher ups working for them. Like, rather than, oh, we got a problem, boss, this one's yours. It's, we got a problem. Here's what needs to happen. Here's what I need you to do. I need you to get me 3 people. I need you to like, you know, do this. They just stay in charge until it's done. The fourth thing is how, you know, we deal with moving targets, where the ordinary contributor tends to stay focused and keep doing what, like, no, this was my target. This is what I said I was going to do. The impact players are just changing and adapting. Instead of trying to minimize and manage change, they're like, I get it. The world is changing. Let me change with it. And then the last one is what we do when there's just unrelenting demand, like more work than you can humanly do, where workload increasing faster than resources. You know, ordinary contributors tend to like, they carry their weight on teams, but when things get really heavy, they look for relief. And the impact players are just making work light for everyone. They're kind of low maintenance. You know, we all know people who are just easy to work with. Impact player is easy to work with. So when you look at that set of behaviors, you know, the impact players, it's rangy, it's bold, it's courageous. Like, they're kind of got not sharp elbows, but wandering elbows. They're like, hey, let me just go where I am needed. And as I really looked at what do managers need to do, like, my first reaction is, well, it's like a training and development issue. You've got to build this mindset and the skills. But then I'm like, you know what you really have to do is just give people permission to do what they want to do and they know is needed. It's a permitting issue. And so, like, what managers and cultures need to do is like, how do we allow people to do the right thing? How do we allow people to be flexible and fluid? How do we allow people to kind of call BS on, well, this was the target we set for the year? Well, yeah, but then there was this pandemic. Like, do you remember that? Well, but this was the target. Like, we need to be able to say, okay, yeah, that was our goal, but the world has changed. Let's rev that goal. I actually think impact player behavior is natural behavior, and it's stuff that we've learned not to do.
Unlearned.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the future? I mean, it's sort of whether these leadership and impact player behaviors are going to get us through this extraordinary time of change and uncertainty as we all go back to work in whatever kind of hybrid way we want to do. I'm betting you think these qualities will carry us through, but are there adjustments that need to be made? Do you think what it takes to be an impact player, what it takes to be a multiplier will have to change in some way given what's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's think about what seems kind of inevitable, that our problems are getting more complex and they will continue to be more complex. I think we're going to be dealing with messier and messier problems. I think institutional distrust, it seems like it's at a peak, but like this is going to get worse, not better, don't you think? Like, I think we're becoming inherently more suspicious of anything large, anything institutional, whether it's workplaces or religion or governments. And, I think we're going to continue to chop up pieces of work, to Danny's point that we're thin slicing, small bite kind of work. And so I think we have to figure out, how do we create workplaces where we can assemble that work? There was a term for it a few years ago and it's failing me now, but these like teams that like flash mobs, but like this flash work team. And I think it's kind of the model that we have to figure out, like, how do we quickly assemble talent to solve a problem and dissolve it without feeling like we failed, but then reabsolve it, which means managers have to figure out how to give people more autonomy, more flexibility, how to build trust in the team and in the mission rather than trust in the institution. Like, oh, gee, like, I think we're going to see an end of all of this silly talk on, I'm going to be like, these are a bunch of my clients that I'm going to be making fun of, but like the Googlers, the Twillions, the Juniperians, like all these names that we give to like people who wear the brand of, I work in this place.
I love it. There's two things. One is you're making me think of, I got to listen to Thomas Friedman.
Oh, lucky you. Yeah.
And he was at the ASU GSV conference and he was giving us a précis of his new book, which is going to be called, and you heard it here first, What You Say When You Listen. And it's all about the situation that you just described. He said the world's problems are so complex and things are moving so quickly that success means forming these sort of radical partnerships. They can only be solved not by the people on your team, not even by people in your company, but these sort of collaborative partnerships that are super dynamic and come together. And these sort of complex partnerships. So you're making me think about that a lot.
Well, and just listening to that, so much of our mentality around talent management is like build and hold on to talent.
Yes.
Yeah.
And like, we have to learn how to let go of talent and not pride ourselves of like, oh, this person's been employed here 10 years or 15 years. Like, we're keeping them. And it's like, we have to feel like more comfortable assembling and releasing talent. And like while we're together, we're going to have this amazing experience. And then we're going to go our separate ways and come back together. Of course, there'll be work teams that stay together, but like how we integrate outsiders and then appreciate the work they're doing. Maybe I'm focused on this because I have a hard time saying goodbye. Like, I worked at Oracle for 17 years. And I think one of the reasons is I just didn't like leaving is hard. Saying goodbye to you, I sobbed the day I left. Oh. And I don't like goodbyes, but that's the only way we're going to be able to operate autonomously, self-directed, pointing towards problems.
I think that's a really interesting point, Liz. And it has such major repercussions for the rest of the organization, right? How do we train people? How do we get people up to speed this quickly? How do we communicate with people? All of those things have to change from the traditional way that we do them to support people in roles for 5 years. It's how we recruit people. All of that stuff will have to change in order to support this vision that you just sort of set forth and Thomas Friedman obviously has as well.
Well, and I don't know that I said it first. I just am describing what seems like it's happening, and think about how this changes organizational life, because organizational life is built on this collective soft hatred of the other inside. Like, we hate this other group, and like we bond together. And how many managers are like, yeah, we've got a toxic larger culture, but I'm going to create a microclimate that's healthy. So like, so built into our like psyches as leaders is us versus them, and the bad guys and the good guys inside, whether it's you work at Microsoft or a hospital. And like, groups sort of have fed off that. Like, oh, we're somehow like superior to them. We're special, we're superior, we're not the problem. We're going to be like the saviors to the problem children in the organization. And like, managers aren't going to have that as a currency for building a team. And then when we look at like the political implications of it, all the polarization that's happening, and we feed within our groups about the thems and the others and the people who see the world wrong and we see it right. Like, the only way those problems get solved is if we give up those identities and build teams around problem solving, like across the aisle, like purpley kinds of teams. And inside, or whether that's in the political realm or inside organizations.
I think we want to wrap up with just one final question, which is what we call the purpose question. And this is a question we ask to everybody that's on our podcast. And that question is, why do you personally do what you do?
Well, I do the work I do because I love work. Like, I love the process of work. I love the hard. I like the challenges of organizations. Like, for me, it's interesting. And I really, like, I get a lot of satisfaction out of the work I do. And I think what fuels me in doing this for others is like, I want work to be an enriching experience, not just one where we get rich, but where learning is a byproduct of work. Not like, what kind of learning do we need to have to perform at our best and create wealth, but like, how do we walk out of a day of work smarter, stronger, better, happier? Like, I want work to be like a positive, joyful, enriching kind of experience for everyone. And I feel like a little bit privileged in that I've been lucky in that I had to work. Financially, I had to work. Like, I had to put myself through college. I needed work to go well, but I've also been blessed to have had a pretty kind of like rich work experience. And like, it'd be pretty cool if everyone had an experience like that. I don't know. That's sort of what fuels me. And I hate bad bosses. Like, I really, really hate micromanaging, diminishing bosses. And I'd like to see few of them in the world. I'd like to be put out of a job in that regard.
Amen to that. Well, thanks, Liz.
Liz, thank
awesome
you so
to have
much.
you on the
so much.
podcast.
Well, it's a joy to talk to all of you. So thank you. And I'm so delighted that I could be on your podcast.
Thanks everybody for listening to this episode of Workplace Stories. Danny and Stacia, how can listeners get more involved in the podcast and of course with your great work?
Well, they can follow Workplace Stories by Red Thread Research on the podcast platform of your choice. And you can go to ratethispodcast.com/workplace stories and leave us ratings and reviews.
You can also share this or your favorite episode with a colleague or a friend.
You can check out our website at redthreadresearch.com to follow all of our latest trends in people practices and sign up to participate in some of our research.
Or Stacia, they could maybe
sign up for our weekly newsletter at redthreadresearch.com/newsletter. And consider joining the Red Thread community by joining our membership.
And lastly, we're on Twitter at RedThreadRe. That's RedThreadRe. Or look up Red Thread Research on LinkedIn and follow our work.
And thanks so much for listening.
We would like to thank our friends at Torch for sponsoring this podcast season. Torch is the people development platform that fuels leadership development through the power of trusted relationships. By combining coaching, mentoring, and collaborative learning, Torch helps you develop successful leaders aligned with your organization's strategy and values. Our customers deliver compelling leadership development experiences to their employees in support of their strategic initiatives. These include high-potential programs, new manager onboarding, DEI change management, and others. The result is increased employee engagement, retention, and performance. Visit trch.info/redthread for more information. Workplace Stories is a production of Red Thread Research and the Learning Futures Group. Thanks for listening.